Great. So we are recording now and we're going to get started. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming today and really excited to be able to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years on digital executive leadership and really trying to help leaders in the public sector and leaders in government be able to better understand some of the challenges and possibilities of the digital era. I'm joined by a few of the instructors in our program who you'll have a chance to hear from in a few minutes. And really great to have some folks joining us from, I know, various parts of Canada, and I think some people internationally as well. Again, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like to. Um, so what our plan is for today's session, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the Digital Executive Leadership Program that we at Think Digital run in partnership with the Institute on Governance, which is a nonprofit based here in Ottawa, Ontario. Talk a little bit about the origins of the program and the type of content that we cover in the program. We're also going to have a bit of a discussion around some of the big trends from digital leaders that we've been seeing. We've been running this program now for 5 years. And it's been interesting over the evolution of it to get a sense of what some of the big trends are that governments are dealing with around the world. And then finally, we're going to have some open Q&A and have a chance to answer questions from all of you, both about the program, but also more broadly about some of the trends we're seeing in digital government. So why did we create the Digital Executive Leadership Program? Well, this quote from Scott Bryson, who was the Minister of Digital Government, President of the Treasury Board in the federal government 6 or 7 years ago, always kind of stood out. This notion that in the 21st century, every organization, including government, needs to be a digital era organization. But I always worried about that kind of third option that I think government has the risk of falling into, of being the digital zombie that does just enough to keep on moving, but not enough to be able to move further. And so, as we look at the space around digital, and for myself personally, I spent a number of years inside government working on digital transformation initiatives before leaving government and working as a trainer and a consultant, both with my company, Think Digital, and as an associate at the Institute on Governance. We saw this real gap that often digital was being thought about as about technology itself and not about the deeper policy and process changes that need to happen as part of that. As this quote from Jennifer Polka, who's a civic tech leader from the US and a chief technology officer under President Obama, gets at, technology modernization alone doesn't actually get us very far. And what really the call of the digital era has been is for a deeper transformation of how government works. And similarly, this definition of digital that I often use, which comes from Tom Loosemore, who was one of the co-founders of the Government Digital Service in the UK, always drives home is that when we're talking about digital, it's not just about the technology. It is also equally about the culture and practices and processes of the digital era, these new ways of working, these new mindsets, and that ability to help governments be able to meet the expectations that are continuously rising from citizens and employees. And so this for us was really the inspiration for creating the Digital Executive Leadership Program back in 2018. I think we saw a real gap that there wasn't a lot of programs for those who were in management and leadership roles in government to not necessarily get into the deep technical details of new technology, but to more broadly understand as a leader, what does digital mean for them? What do they need to understand? And how do they demystify some of the things that they're hearing about that are increasingly impacting the world that they are living in? So our very first cohort of the Digital Executive Leadership Program launched way back now in December of 2018. It's gone through a number of iterations over the years, not the least of which was when COVID hit in 2020, we switched formats from an entirely in-person program to an entirely virtual program. We'll talk a little bit about some of the fun stuff we've been able to do virtually, including using virtual reality. You'll see a couple of our class photos there from those kind of COVID and post-COVID cohorts where we were in VR. And in the last year or two have moved back to a hybrid format, trying to get the best of both worlds around that. So the program itself is really designed as a 6-day boot camp for managers and leaders and senior advisors within government to understand the basics of the digital world. Our first day of the program is very much an introduction to digital government. We look at the big digital trends that are impacting not just Canadian governments, but governments around the world. We then do a series of deep dives into 3 different topics. One day focused on design thinking, a third day focused on digital tech, and our fourth day focused on data science, including topics like artificial intelligence that have become more and more pertinent over the last few years. And then our last 2 days are really kind of our leadership workshop days. We spend day 5 thinking about how do we work digitally, things like agile, things like building modern digital teams. What are the approaches that are effective to be able to do that? We always have, which is one of the highlights of the program, a networking dinner event at the end of day 5, where we bring in a guest speaker and get a chance to have a bit more of a social networking atmosphere around the program. And then our last day is what we call our Taking Action Day, where we really get people to start thinking about how can they take some of the concepts and approaches that they've learned in the program, take it back to their work and actually be able to make an impact and a difference. All throughout this, we use a variety of different methods to be able to help people unpack some of these topics. We have expert lecturers and instructors, guest speakers, and practitioners who can share some of their experience on the front line, so to speak. We have case studies that we bring in from different governments to be able to unpack. And importantly, we also try to build in hands-on activities so people get a chance to actually try some of the concepts and in some cases, some of the technologies that we're using, including, as I mentioned, one of the interesting pieces we've brought in over the last couple of years is using virtual reality technology in the classroom, which I'll share a little bit about in a few minutes. And the outcomes really that we are trying to get from this program is, number one, a better awareness of digital trends and helping to demystify some of the buzzwords that are out there. That ability to provide a more digitally savvy strategic leadership, help people to be change agents within their organizations, and to help people increase their networks and be able to find some of those real kind of practical tactics for success in the future. And I'd say at its most basic level, my goal always is coming out of this program that people can ask better questions. Folks who are sitting around the management table, who are in leadership roles, we want them to be able to ask good questions and feel confident talking about issues where technology and public policy are intersecting with each other. This is just a snapshot of, for the virtual part of the program, the first 4 days of it, what the rhythm looks like. And again, we try to have a mix of opportunities for discussion amongst participants, having instructors being able to do teaching portions, having guest speakers, having some hands-on activities, and a variety of different methodologies to be able to absorb and dive into the various types of topics that we're covering in the program. And speaking of topics, there's a lot we cover. It is meant to be an intensive 6 days. It is not unsurprising that participants walk out of it, with their heads feeling quite full, with a lot of material to digest. We also provide a number of resources for them to be able to take away and look at afterwards to dive into some of these topics further as they want to explore it. But this is kind of a non-exhaustive list of some of the major topics that we do cover in the program. And what I wanted to do at this point actually is very happy to have 4 of our instructors joining us who have been part of this program since the very beginning, have helped to shape it, and are teaching different parts of it. I'm going to ask them all just to share a couple of minutes around some of the topics that they cover in the program, and importantly, what they think some of the key takeaways from that are. So, Amanda, I'll turn the floor over to you first.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks so much to everybody for coming. It's a great opportunity to chat with you. So my name's Amanda Clarke, and I'm a professor at Carleton University. I teach in the School of Public Policy and Administration. And as Ryan noted, I've been working with this program since the beginning. It's one of the highlights of my job is getting a chance to meet public servants, some who are already working in the digital space, others coming from a whole range of different functional areas who are enthusiastic about beefing up their own digital literacy and becoming more competent leaders for digital era governments, which I think is, been identified sort of time and time again in the research as one of the main barriers to effective digital government modernization, but also one of the main enablers and drivers. So leaders really matter here, and that's where all of you become very important to this whole project. So my talk, which happens always at the beginning of the the whole course is really focused on giving you a sort of a lay of the land. So I begin with kind of a historical review of how we got to where we are today. How have governments from sort of about the 50s on thought about digital technologies and built, and where has digital capacity been built or not built in the state, and how has this affected the policy capacity really of our governments. So we walk through that history. Then I try to give some kind of boundaries to what are we even talking about with digital government reform? What is digital transformation in a public sector context? As Ryan helpfully noted, this is not just about technology. In fact, that's a very small piece of it. It's actually, a really kind of broader set of organizational, administrative reforms that are changing, that should be changing the way the policy process unfolds and the kinds of work that we do on a daily basis when we're working in the public sector. So this is a bigger public administration reform movement, but I also want to not overwhelm and provide some sense of like, okay, well then what are the bounds here? So I try to walk through a bit of a contrast between what government looks like now and what the research and experience is showing government needs to look like in order to be effective in a digital context. So things like moving from a planning-oriented organizational culture to a more learning-focused organizational culture, which creates room for iteration, early prototyping, and agile methods as a not just way of thinking about software, but more broadly about thinking about the creation of policies and services. So I also talk about a shift from being a culture that, is clearly governments have always been aware of the value of data and information and have historically been some of the strongest information collectors and users. But, in the digital context, that like the need to be data competent and data literate and is like ever more clear. And so we talk about that shift, a shift from, a culture organized around silos and information hoarding or kind of functional separation to moving towards multidisciplinary teams, working across boundaries. One thing I try to really do with this sort of like, what is digital government all about section of my unit is one, sort of like set up my wonderful counterparts by saying like, here's a little like taste of what you're going to learn much more about when Meghan joins you. And here's what Jen is going to helpfully unpack for you in her unit on data and AI. So it's a little bit of a like taster, but then also try to like underscore that a lot of the things we're asking for digital government reform are not new, right? Like we've, for decades been talking about how governments should engage with service users more and bring stakeholders into the policy process, or that governments should be more focused on learning and like course correcting as opposed to sticking to long-term plans, even when the evidence suggests that that's likely to lead to failure. So really also like making sure we all come at this with a healthy appreciation for these are not new ideas, but they actually have much more currency and urgency in a digital context. And then the last thing we do in my unit is like realistically acknowledging that the things we're talking about in the entire course and in my unit are sort of wish list items in many cases, right? Like you're all going to, many people return to their government organizations. And even though there might be a high level directive saying you're going to start being more agile and user-centered and data focused, change is hard in all large organizations, and public sector bureaucracies are resistant to change particularly. So part of what you're going to face, as leaders in this space, is you may be equipped with the digital literacy that you need after completing this course, but you're also going to face an institution where there's tons of barriers, organizational, cultural, human resources based. And so part of what your job at this stage of this whole public administration revolution is like learning how to navigate those barriers. So we talk concretely about like, what are the strategies that work well? And we kind of brainstorm a list together. So that's my little section, and happy to chat with anybody else. If you have further questions, you feel free to reach out to me, but I hope to have the chance to include you in that unit sometime in the future.
Great. Thanks, Amanda, for the overview. And I think that's a good comprehensive look at some of the themes that you're able to pick up on. And as you said, one of the pieces that we do talk about in this course and have a day on is design thinking. So I'm going to pass it over to Meghan for a moment to talk a little bit about some of the key themes that she covers in her module.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and hello, everyone. So my name is Meghan Hellstern. I'm joining you from Toronto, the Dish with One Spoon territory. So we spend a full day on design thinking for good reason. As much as technology is a huge part of all things digital, the human element is really where we need to begin. And so we spend a full day on human-centered design, really looking everything from the beginning cycle of building empathy, conducting user research, really trying to understand the user needs that we're trying to meet, whether that's with external facing services to the public or even internally with our colleagues and peers. We then look at things like ideation and prototyping and testing. How do we take those insights that we've generated and gathered, make sense of them, and then use that to actually drive experimentation and innovation, try new things, do that in a low risk way that lets us gather feedback and really use an evidence-informed approach to where we invest our precious time and energy. Often it can sometimes feel like, technology, we're throwing gasoline on top of, a burning fire. And so it's sort of like, let's make sure that we're being strategic about where we put that gas. We want to put it in a car, so we go further rather than accelerating potentially some of the challenges that we're already facing. And so we spend a lot of time on things like problem definition, de-risking, prototyping and testing. This is also where we get to jump into virtual reality, which I believe Ryan's going to talk about in more detail a little later. But through a few of our cohorts, we've been using virtual reality to actually do what we call sort of in-context prototyping and testing. So, picture, for example, if you're trying to improve air travel, you could actually prototype and test inside a mock-up of an airport. And actually try out new models, whether it's for faster security screening or entertaining, children while they're waiting for delayed flights, things like that. So really trying to experiment with these new types of technology and bringing, the best practices of human-centered design into that. We also spend some time on a couple sort of, I call them adjunct topics that are really important. Things like inclusive design and ensuring that we are really considering the diverse needs of different users, not just sort of the mainstream. We also look at design and leadership and sort of how even non-design professionals or non-design experts can still champion and support this type of approach in their work. And we also look at, a number of different sort of practices within this big umbrella of design that can be very valuable when it comes to accelerating digital transformation within these public service and government organizations. So much like Amanda, I would love to have an opportunity to hang out with you in virtual reality, prototype and test together, things like that in the future. And it's been a super huge honor and delight to be part of this program. Over the past few years, we've really sharpened and tightened our programming as a result of feedback. And I'm very, very excited to see what the future will hold for us all. So with that, I think I will hand it back over to Ryan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Meghan. That's great. Wonderful overview of your section. I'm going to jump actually over to Jen next. And Jen is our resident expert on all things data science and AI, and get Jen to share a little bit about her modules that she runs on our day-to-day.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. I'll just give a little introduction to myself as well. So yeah, I'm the CEO and principal of Sysidy, which is a data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence consulting and implementation company in Ottawa. I've done a lot of work with a wide range of government departments on projects in this area. And I'm also lucky enough to be an adjunct at Carleton in the cognitive science department, where I'm embedded in an AI research lab. And so, I was thinking, Ryan, as you were talking about the history, that we started this in such an interesting time, 2018, to where we are now. There's been a huge change in the AI, data science, machine learning space. And that's something that we try to address and capture in our data science day. So structurally, we sort of break it into a morning where we get into key ideas and concepts in this space. And then we switch over to doing more hands-on and also demo-oriented pieces in the afternoon. And we think that's really important because, I mean, we still make a big effort to keep the focus, as people have already been saying, on the human-centered piece, because absolutely that's important. But you do have to delve into the technology a little bit at some point, and that's kind of what we do. So in the morning, you know, we want to cover off both concepts that will last, that will stand the test of time despite the pace of change in this space. And so we ask fundamental questions like, how is it possible for an object, a machine, to learn? What does that actually mean? But then we also want to really pay attention to the trends within government, for example. So when robotic processing automation landed on the scene, we talked about that, but also just in the wider space in general. We're going through what I would call the AI explosion right now, the democratization of these technologies. And so we both talk about that, and we talk about how the government is managing that and grappling with it, and also how to, you know, think about and potentially use these tools. So we do a lot of, we give people a lot of opportunity to actually put their hands on some of the tools that they may have only heard about to this point. And that's a lot of that is what's happening in the afternoon. We have a team exercise where people really get to experience what it's like to do a little bit of data. I won't say data science per se, but we focus on the what comes out of a data science pipeline and what it's like to go through each of those stages. And then, of course, there's the cutting edge part, which in our case looks at the intersection between data science, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality. So kind of blasting off into the future there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jen, so much, and for sharing a bit about what is increasingly a very pertinent part of this program that's coming up, and I know top of mind for many people. So thank you. I'm gonna next go to Mike Gifford. Mike, happy to have you share a little bit about your modules around accessibility and sustainability.
Excellent. So Mike Gifford, I'm now the Open Practices and Open Standards lead at Civic Actions. Previously, I've been CEO of Open Concept, which is an Ottawa-based business. I'm now actually working primarily for the U.S. government through Civic Actions. Although right now I'm located in France. I'll be back in Ottawa in August, though. So there's a number of things that I try and go off and bring to this module. First of all, trying to take it from a standards perspective. So there's a number of different standards. We actually start with language and the sort of there's a number of pieces of legislation around language we want to go off and remind people to and try and refresh people's memory about that and tie that into the tech stack, because that's sometimes not clear, is the relationship between the policies and standards that the government sets and what do the impacts for technology. And there's a lot of software that just is not well designed for multilingual content. And there's a lot of pre-thought that needs to be made to go off and make digital content bilingual or multilingual. And there's almost a number of different languages that the government agencies need to try and address, including Indigenous languages. Now, accessibility is an area that's really quite important to me. I'm a Drupal core accessibility maintainer. I'm also a WC3 invited expert. Very interested in trying to go and to set to try and make government websites as accessible as possible and to help help sort of manage the policies and the organizations and the processes that are necessary to make that happen. So explaining a little bit about what is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and how does that apply to, or how does that relate to other standards you may have heard of, like EN 301549, which is the European standard. I'm also able to bring a bit more of an international perspective to this because of got contacts and connections in Europe and also in the United States, and so I'm very connected with what's happening in other places, and in some cases a bit more connected than I am with what's happening in Canada. Exciting places in all, but definitely interested in that. Sustainability is an area where I'm also looking to in this module to try and raise awareness. Partly because this is an emerging area, an area that people are looking at. We do live in a climate crisis. We all need to take our own measures to go off and to reduce our environmental footprint, and digital is often overlooked. So how do we try and raise awareness about the impact of digital, on our planet and our water supplies and our carbon footprint, and what can we do to try and shape policies and processes to try and make that easier, to lighten the footprint that we're having on our planet, and make it easier for us to go off and to start to build a more environmentally friendly digital ecosystem. There's a long way we need to go in that regard, but it's something that there's a lot to learn from web accessibility, but there's also evolving standards like the web sustainability guidelines from the WC3. This is a community group and a working group that is starting off and is hoping to go off and to set standards that the governments can start to implement. But it's something that we need to start talking about and raising awareness now, because it will have impacts in the future.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that very much, and appreciate you joining us too in your evening in France. I know it's a little bit later in the day for you there as well, so thank you. So, I hope that gives everybody a good sense of some of the types of topics that we're covering. You get a little bit of a flavor of our amazing instructor team. We've got a number of other instructors too who weren't able to join us today, but we really have, I think, a unique mix of people who truly understand, in a deep way, some of the big trends that are impacting governments in our modern digital era. And in my role as program director and as chair of the program, there are both some sessions that I teach, but I also try to play that kind of connective glue between the different sessions and help kind of host and guide people through our week-long learning journey together. The last piece I wanted to say just about the content, as we've mentioned a couple times, one of the unique things we've been able to do with this program is try bring some hands-on content to it. And the pandemic actually gave us a unique opportunity to pivot a little bit on this, because as with everybody, we were forced to bring our programming and our work fully online. And we wanted to get away from the trap of just being stuck on Zoom or Teams and having kind of a two-dimensional experience. Virtual reality technology was on the upswing. There was both kind of a lot of a hype around it, but also the technology had emerged to a point where we actually thought there was some interesting possibilities around using that in the classroom. So about 3 years ago, we actually introduced virtual reality into our program, where participants get a headset and we do about an hour or so a day of our activities in the VR space. And really the two goals behind this were, number one, if we're in a more virtual or hybrid environment, how do we kind of connect people and have that sense of connection with peers in a bit of a different way? But secondly, these technologies may find themselves increasingly in our workplace in the coming years. And we wanted to give government leaders and executives an opportunity to actually be exposed to this technology and be able to try it out and see what the possibilities are. And so there's two kind of primary substantive ways that we've been using it in the program. One is as part of Meghan's module, using it for design thinking and actually getting people to look at the opportunity to do prototyping in a virtual reality environment for a bit more of immersive experience. And the second is for data visualization. In Jen's module, we've been using VR to be able to look at how you can explore data in a three-dimensional way and have a different type of experience with it. And I'll just play for you in the background as we're going through this. A little bit of a clip from one of the platforms we use called Arthur. This is a kind of a look at some design thinking activities where you can almost imagine, some of those types of whiteboarding and collaborative activities, but in a VR environment with kind of a different way of being able to interact with each other. So certainly brings some interesting engagement to it. We also do a fair bit of onboarding ahead of time because we know this is new technology for the participants. Our colleague Aislinn, who's on the line, is one of the people who works with our participants to help them get onboarded and learn how to be able to use this technology. And we find it can be a really fun experience for people who are taking the program. So that's, I think an overview of the content in the program. I want to just finally share kind of a couple of numbers with you and a little bit of what we've seen over the program over the last 5 years. So we've run 17 cohorts of this executive leadership program since December of 2018. Almost 250 participants from across Canada have joined us across those cohorts. We've had a lot of people from the federal government, as I'll share in a minute. 38 different federal organizations have sent representatives to our program. We've had 4 municipal governments participate, 3 provincial organizations, and 1 not-for-profit organization. And also, I think importantly note that about 1/5, 20% of our participants have been from outside of Ottawa, outside of the National Capital Region. In particular, as we've moved more of the programming to be online or hybrid, it's opened up possibilities for people from across the country to be able to participate. And we have had participants literally from coast to coast to coast, from the West Coast across the prairies. A number of participants from Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, as well as Barrie. Up north in Nunavut, we've had participants from Quebec in both Montreal and Quebec City, and then out on the East Coast in PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. So it's been a great part of this is, not just to connect people from different organizations and departments, but connect people from different parts of the country through this learning journey. As I mentioned, large majority of our participants to date have been from the federal government, though we've also been really excited to have participants from municipal and provincial governments and a little bit from the NGO sector. And I should note that our program very much is designed to be applicable for people at any level of government or in any public sector organization. So one of the things that we're really trying to put a bit of a focus on is to see how we can get more and more people joining us from different parts of the country, and very welcome to those of you who are joining us as well on today's webinar who are coming from different sectors in different parts of the country. We build the program obviously as an executive leadership program, but importantly to note, it is not strictly for executives. We also accept managers and those in senior advisor roles who are likely to move into leadership positions further in career. And so as you can kind of see across our three types of programs we've run, our on-site, our virtual, and our hybrid, about 75 to 85% of the participants have been executives or the equivalent of executives in their organizations. And then somewhere between about a quarter to 15% of our participants are at that managerial or senior advisor level. So I also should note that we tend to have an interesting mix of people between IT roles and non-IT roles. And many of our cohorts have been roughly 50-50. And I think that mix of people who are both in different levels of leadership and also different types of programs really brings an interesting mix of discussion to the classroom. One of the interesting things we always do is at the beginning of the course and at the end of the course, we ask people to self-assess their level of digital literacy as well as their home organization's level of digital literacy. And as you can see from this graph, the average across all of our cohorts that we've run is that people tend to assess themselves at about a 6.8 before the course and about a 7.5 after the course. So we notice you see at least a 1 point in general increase in people's kind of confidence or their self-assessed level of digital literacy. And interestingly, we see a similar bump up in terms of their view of their organization, that many people kind of after they do the course feel their organization is in many cases perhaps doing better than they thought they were, and they see kind of that equal bump up. So it's always quite interesting to kind of statistically see that there is a bit of change in perspective from people who go through the program. And just finally, I wanted to say, I think we really have kind of valued some of the feedback that we've been getting from people throughout the program. We ask always people, how people would describe the program in one sentence to a colleague. This gives you a little bit of kind of a word cloud view of what that looks like. But importantly as well, we try to always collect quantitative and qualitative data around this. And I think consistently we've had, very high ratings and positive feedbacks from people on the program. These are some of our kind of key questions that we ask, and this is averaged across all 17 cohorts of the program on a 5-point scale. And anybody who does program evaluation for learning like this will know if you're hitting 4.5 or above, or 9 and above on a 10-point scale, you're doing quite well on that. And we've been really pleased to see that we've had kind of consistently strong feedback and support in the program, and even in some of our qualitative assessments. I think we always get some really great feedback. And I will say we very much try to practice what we talk about in the classroom in terms of iteration and user feedback. And this program over the last 5 years has continued to go through a series of iterations based on the feedback that we've heard from our participants. So I want to kind of go into one other direction before we kind of open this up broadly for questions. And this is just to say that, you know, in the 5 years that we've run this program, it's been really interesting to kind of see the feedback from our participants and some of the things that they are dealing with in their work. And there have been some consistent trends that we've noticed that have come up over that time. And I'll share just a few of them from my perspective that I've kind of seen have been, you know, really prominent and consistent across the cohorts. And then I'll invite my colleagues who are on the line to maybe share some of their perspective on this as well. But a few things that we've heard from, you know, the hundreds of people who've now taken the program. First of all, is this notion that digital is no longer just an IT thing, right? Back in the day, it was the domain of the CIO. It was about keeping the networks going, keeping the lights on. We're now seeing that digital is infusing everything the government does. It is touching every policy area. It is touching every aspect of service delivery. And so really, it has become everybody's job. And there is a wide consensus that people want to be using user-centered design. They want to have a human-centered approach. They want to be agile and iterative. But the ways of working in the public service, broadly speaking, have not caught up. And issues like budgeting and project gating, procurement, and human resources come up time and time again as being some of those stumbling blocks that people fall into. The rise of social media, our increasing interconnectedness, and on the one hand has certainly opened up new possibilities and new ways of working. But the flip side is people feel that signal to noise problem has gotten larger than ever, and that ability to discern what is important from the amount of information that they are dealing with is something that a lot of leaders are facing. And then finally, just a deep sense of transformation fatigue. You know, there have been successive waves of transformation going through most government organizations, and that only got amplified during COVID and the pandemic, and the deep level of transition that government organizations have had to go through over the last few years as a result of that. So we see these as some really key themes that a number of our participants are facing in different ways. But I wanted to maybe open it up for a moment to my colleagues, to Meghan and Amanda and Mike, if they have some other thoughts they want to add on some of the trends that they've been seeing from our participants over the last few years. Meghan, I'll go over to you first.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. So one that's comes to mind sort of immediately is really sort of this tension between chasing the shiny new things and the emerging technologies with getting the basics right. And you sort of hint at it around some of the infrastructure and pieces like that, but you know, the legacy of legacy technology still looms large. You know, there's sort of a running joke that some of the systems running our pension you know, programs in the government of Canada are old enough to have a pension themselves. And, you know, it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but there's a little bit of truth to that, right? And so as much as I'm a full supporter and believer in, you know, leveraging the best of what we have available, I do still feel there's this real need and importance for us to continue being mindful of the fact that we're really working with a long tail of technology that needs to be brought into the modern era. And it's sort of not just technology, but that wider spread of digital that Ryan talked about earlier. The other two pieces that I'll maybe talk about are one, you know, there's sort of this idea that I would argue that essentially all of government and all of the public sector is digital in some way, shape, or form. I think in the past, there was sort of this impression that, oh, you know, like the IT group, that's their realm, or, oh, you know, like I'm just doing back office stuff. I don't need to really pay too much attention to this. The reality is that the world is digital. You know, software is eating the world, as Mark Andreessen, you know, famously said. And no one's really immune to that. And so I've been finding it really interesting to see the diversity of folks coming in to the program, I think expanding with that. You know, you're seeing folks from, you know, policy areas and things like that, that you might not have historically necessarily associated with something like a digital executive leadership program. And so, you know, even if you're not necessarily working in tech or digital or intend to do that, there's a lot of value in building up this sense of technical and digital intuition, as they call it. And then the last thing I'll say that I think we can't ignore is that there's this moment, I think, of popular consciousness around this. Things like ArriveCan, things like the Centrelink scandal in Australia, things like the post office scandal in the UK. These are massive, public, highly visible sort of acute representations of what can happen when we don't have that technical and digital intuition and leadership, when we're not necessarily making decisions that lead to that long-term public value and impact. And so that, I find, has led to both this double-edged sword of more attention, more willingness to engage even with the public on this type of stuff. But then there's also, the higher scrutiny and sort of that sense of risk aversion, right? Where it's like, oh, what if we're the next Phoenix, or what if we're the next Interlink? And that is tough to reconcile when we do need smart, calculated, bold leadership, right? That feels empowered and capable of leaning into what the future has to hold for us. So those are my kind of armchair reflections. I'd be curious to hear what others are thinking about as well.
That's great. Thanks, Megan. I think all very pertinent. Amanda or Mike, any additional thoughts? Amanda, go over to you next.
Yeah, totally agree with Megan that I think this is like a time where, the public facing scandals associated with digital failures are really hitting home more. And I think there is a risk that it goes like the wrong direction, which is that leaders in the public sector decide that like technology projects are so risky that they are just like, they want to like have this willful blindness to what's going on around them, or learned helplessness, and sort of pretend that they don't have accountability for that, or try to outsource accountability, or leave it to the IT folks. And what we hope is the proper response to that is like, okay, these were technology projects that are the product of management failures. And one of the reasons those management failures arose is because of a lack of literacy. So it's like incumbent on leaders to get that, now. And so that's like hopefully where we end up playing. Two things that I think I'd like to flag as important emerging or kind of big, juicy issues that I'm thinking a lot about now when it comes to digital. One is how we get the relationship right with the vendor community. I mean, that's like been a long-standing question, but I think for a while, most of what we were focused on in thinking about building digital capacity and digital modernization was bringing that capacity back in-house, right? Like that's a lot, and that's what we're trying to do through this entire educational initiative. And that's a huge piece of it, but it's like necessary but not sufficient, because there's always going to be a role for private vendors to play in designing, delivering digital services in the public sector, whether that's providing things like cloud infrastructure or working as like a kind of surge capacity in designing a new service or what. And so one thing I've been doing lately is like interviewing folks working in government who are in the digital transformation space or part of, digital initiatives or digital service teams, and asking like, how are you managing your relationship with vendors, and what does that look like? And there's a really fascinating divide that that's emerging, which is that the cluster of countries that Canada's with, which is largely countries that's in the 80s and 90s, and this is something I talk about in my unit in the course, is the like kind of largely outsourced, right? And we're really captured by vendors and weren't in a position to be smart shoppers. Other jurisdictions, and they happen to be the countries that are really bounding ahead and building like solid digital public services, are, they don't actually see that tension. Like when I talk to them, they're like, oh, well, we've always worked closely with vendors, but we have tons of skills in-house. We're part of an ecosystem. We don't see them as necessarily, sure, we acknowledge that they have a profit motive, but also like we align their incentives with public value. We manage them accordingly. We create contracts that have shorter time frames so we can get out of it if it's a bad relationship. Like they don't see vendors as complicated because they've always worked well with them, and they're really building up that capacity. So this is in places like Estonia and Finland, and Ukraine, like really fascinating, the divide. And so I think that's something that in Canada we have a lot to learn from, and thinking about like ArriveCan has presented the vendor and the consulting community as like the evil boogeyman of overcost digital failures. And I think actually we want to like mature that conversation a bit to say like, well, no, what conditions do we have to put in place in Canadian governments in order to be effective partners with tech firms? And that's something that I want to try to bring in more into my education and training as well, is really like, what are the big key questions you ask of vendors? What is like important to include? What are the key roles you want in-house? What are the things you really shouldn't ever outsource, like strategy, vision, product ownership? But where is there like an appropriate space to really like bring in that community of expertise, because it doesn't make sense to have that on full-time staff in government. So I think that is a really important area to be thinking more and more about. And something that will like not go away, right? Because the tech community, the vendor community are a part of this. They're a big part of digital government modernization necessarily. So that's one area that I find fascinating. And then the other area that I'm really thinking a lot about lately, and that I think should be on all of our minds as people committed to kind of public sector modernization, is the social license piece of digital transformation. So, we spent a lot of time trying to convince political leaders and entrenched status quo oriented public managers to like commit to digital meaningfully, right? But we also need to bring the public along with us and make sure that the things we're pushing for are seen as accountable, legitimate, desirable. Things like a digital identity or more integrated data sharing across government. I mean, we know the benefits are there in terms of how this will make services easier to access, reduce administrative burdens on the most marginalized populations, reduce the cost of government, like all these wonderful things that we should all be pursuing. But like we have to make sure that the public wants them and that we discuss them and put in place the guardrails, whether they're regulatory or kind of more collaborative governance mechanisms. I mean, there's tons of things that we can think about when it comes to how to do this safely, but which are the ones that are going to make the Canadian public go, okay, yeah, I will trust a digital identity. I will be comfortable with Health Canada sharing my data with Employment and Social Development Canada. So I think more public opinion research in this space is needed, more focus groups, really like in-depth engagement with Canadians. Or I think like we don't really do royal commissions anymore because I think they cost money and there's not a lot of that, sort of become less sexy or something. But I think like a royal commission on digital government to understand the public's appetite would be really helpful in this space. So this is something that I'm pretty committed to, and we'll try to, again, bring more and more into my training, is like, how are we thinking about what the public wants and how can you leverage that to drive change? Because if you get some great evidence that like they want this, if this is the change to the Privacy Act, that's where you need to focus your attention then, Yeah,
no, it's some really fascinating points, Amanda, and also just worth noting that in the last couple of years, in part because of these trends, we've actually brought a module from you around procurement into the program to kind of dive into some of these issues further. Mike, any final thoughts from you in terms of big trends you've seen over the last couple of years with our participants?
Well, one thing, I mean, certainly procurement always comes up in conversations, and certainly it's really nice to go off and to see that the interest and the understanding that we need to shape those incentives in working with business. We need to go off and have a more mature approach to how we deal with procurement. And in fact, that's something that I do quite a lot with the U.S. government as well. Open source is another area that comes up quite regularly and that I talk about because I've got a lot of experience with open source. But there was a story, Megan, when you were mentioning about the software that's old enough that it could collect a pension. So Fortran is one of those languages. So Fortran was initiated or launched in 1958. So it's pensionable code. But the Germany's Sovereign Tech Fund, which is a government instituted program to support open source in Germany, they invested 800,000 euros to support Fortran because it's important for their government and for their economy to support this old language. So on the one hand, it is an old language. On the other hand, it's amazing that these things are still so useful and that some of the ideas that were built in that way can still have value. And we often overlook the value of that and the importance of trying to go up and invest in maintaining these languages and tools. But it's always amazing watching people connect across the silos and the excitement and the sparks that are flying especially when you get people together. But people who have worked, maybe they worked in departments together historically, or maybe they just have never met, but they have common concerns and common issues. Seeing the excitement of the public sector getting together and having a chance to say, I had that problem too. What did you do about it? Like, that should happen so much more than it does. But the digital executive leadership program is an area where it seems to happen every single time, that there's new opportunities and there's new excitement around getting people to build that network of people who want to make change happen. So that's all I wanted to add, and it's exciting to go off and to see this time and time again, to see the enthusiasm and the engagement with our participants.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of closing thought on that piece, and that ability to kind of get those sparks and have our participants, not just during the program itself, but in the months and years to come, have a network that they can connect into and be able to drive some of this change forward. I wanted to just share, as we kind of close this out, importantly, for those who might be interested in being a future participant in the Digital Executive Leadership Program, our next cohort is coming up this fall in October and November. And we are actually trying a new format based on the feedback that we've received, where we're going to actually allow people to have a bit of a mix and match approach in terms of hybrid, virtual and in person. So the program essentially is divided up into a 4-day boot camp and a 2-day workshop. And with both the boot camp and the workshop, people will have an opportunity to pick if they want to do it virtually or if they want to do it in person. So what essentially in practice it'll mean is you can either do the whole program virtually or the whole program in person, or you could mix and match and do part of it in person and part of it virtually, depending on your timing and your circumstances and where you are and your ability to travel. And we will, of course, have our dinner event, as we always do, on November 7th, which is going to be open to all participants, regardless of if they're doing the virtual or in-person streams. So we're really excited about this. We're trying to give people more options and more choice in this hybrid world to be able to participate in the program, regardless of where they are across the country. All the information about the program is up on the Institute on Governance website, iog.ca/DELP. And of course, we would be very, very happy to talk to you if you have any questions about this. So please let us know if you do have questions about the program. I really hope that today's webinar has been helpful from the perspective of giving you some more background about the program, some of the big trends we've been seeing, and really we would welcome you to come join us. We think this is really important basic skills that everybody in the digital era needs if they're going to be effective in government. And I think for all of us, we hope that this program is filling an important niche to be able to allow leaders and future leaders to be able to get some of that grounding that they need to be effective in the digital world. So thank you again so much for joining us for this recording today. And again, hope to see you in one of our future cohorts of the Digital Executive Leadership Program.